The sound of cracking ice echoed across the frozen lake like a warning shot fired straight from nature itself, and in that instant everything spun out of control because while I was waving my arms and shouting for the last skaters to get off the lake before the ice sheet gave way beneath them, the HOA president came barreling toward me in her oversized red coat, screaming that I had no right to close something she claimed the HOA owned even though the land beneath her boots belonged to me alone. And as I watched her slip, slide, and flail dangerously close to the thinning ice edge while yelling about festival permits and community rights and accusing me of sabotage, I realized this moment was going to explode into something far bigger than a simple safety warning. Something dramatic and ridiculous and high stakes all at once, because if the ice cracked 1 second earlier or if she took one more angry step in the wrong direction, she would plunge straight into the freezing water below and I would somehow still be blamed for it. That was the moment everything snapped into focus, and I understood that shutting down this lake today would ignite a storm none of us were prepared for. The chaos of that moment stretched into a silence when the skaters finally scrambled to safety on the snowy bank, leaving only the crunch of my boots as I stepped back from the dangerous patch, and she finally managed to steady herself before glaring at me with an expression that made it obvious nothing in her world mattered more than the HOA Winter Festival that she was determined to force onto my frozen property. I tried explaining that the ice thickness had been unstable for days, that the temperature had fluctuated too sharply overnight, that I had drilled and scanned the surface just hours earlier and found hairline fractures spidering beneath the snow like hidden traps waiting for someone unlucky enough to find them, but none of that mattered to her. She moved closer, face red from cold and fury, breath hanging between us like tiny clouds of steam, as she demanded to know who gave me permission to close her lake, and when I calmly reminded her that the deed with my name on it did, she erupted into another tirade about community rights and holiday traditions and the number of emails she had already sent about the upcoming festival that she insisted could not be stopped or rescheduled under any circumstances. She refused to accept that this lake was private, not HOA-controlled, not communal property, and certainly not available for an ice carnival filled with hundreds of people, tents, bonfires, music, booths, and whatever other chaos she had planned. I watched her stomp across the snow, each step crunching angrily as she jabbed her finger toward the lake as if the ice itself should bow to her authority, and she launched into a rant about how I was ruining everything, how her family had been in charge of the festival planning committee for 7 straight years, how she had promised sponsors the biggest turnout yet, how the flyers were already printed and the banners ordered and the volunteers scheduled. She talked so fast she barely breathed, and the words tangled into an avalanche of panic and rage as she listed off every detail she thought proved the universe itself would collapse if the festival was postponed. I remained standing with my hands in my coat pockets, letting the cold air cool the simmering irritation building under my ribs, and I patiently tried explaining again that her festival could go on, just not on my lake, not on ice that was one warm day away from disaster. She answered with a dramatic gasp and announced that I was doing this on purpose, that I was trying to embarrass her in front of the entire community, that I had always hated the HOA even though I rarely interacted with them, and she insisted that this was about control and ego on my part. I simply shook my head and reminded her of the liability alone, of the lives at risk if the ice collapsed during the festival, but she threw up her hands and declared loudly enough for her voice to echo off the tree line that I had no say in the matter whatsoever because the HOA had chosen this lake long before I bought the property, conveniently ignoring the fact that the county records contradicted every word. She paced in circles in the snow, muttering about calling an emergency HOA board meeting, swearing she would get the county sheriff involved, threatening to contact her lawyer, and promising that this battle was far from over. Then she stopped pacing and looked at me with a cold, calculating smirk that made it clear she was about to escalate things in a way that would complicate the next several days of my life. She told me the entire community expected the winter festival, that attendance was mandatory for HOA members, and that my attempt to stop it would be interpreted as a direct attack on the neighborhood. I told her calmly that her festival was not my problem, but the safety of anyone who stepped onto this lake absolutely was, and I had every legal right to close the area until the ice stabilized. She scoffed so loudly it echoed, and then marched away, boots punching deep holes into the snow, her voice fading into the distance as she ranted to herself about power trips and selfish property owners who thought they owned more than they did. I stood there a moment longer, listening to the wind skim across the ice like it was whispering warning after warning, and I felt a strange certainty settle deep in my chest that this was only the beginning. As I walked back toward my cabin, the cold air biting at my face, I kept replaying her words, the threats, the desperation, the odd mix of panic and fury, and it became obvious she had far more at stake than just tradition. She was too invested, too frantic, too quick to threaten legal consequences for a simple safety precaution, and that meant something was hiding beneath her outrage. Something bigger. Something messy. Something she did not want me to uncover. The stillness of the snow-covered forest felt heavier than usual as I approached my front steps, as if the world itself sensed a storm gathering, and with every breath of cold air I took I became more certain that I needed to be careful, because she was not going to let this go. The festival might have been the spark, but the fire she intended to light would burn far hotter than she realized, and as her threats hung in the back of my mind I knew the coming days would be filled with confrontations, schemes, and the kind of HOA madness that could only escalate into something far worse than a simple argument over ice thickness. The next morning the snow was falling in a slow drifting curtain that softened the edges of everything, but there was nothing soft about the way the HOA launched their first wave of ridiculous retaliation, as if they had assembled an emergency war council overnight. I stepped outside with a mug of steaming coffee only to find a group of residents standing at the edge of my property line holding clipboards like they were preparing for a military inspection, and at the center of the group was the HOA president with a triumphant smile that looked far too confident for someone who had nearly fallen through thin ice the day before. She marched toward me waving a stack of papers and announced that the HOA had drafted an official notice demanding that I immediately reopen the lake for festival preparations because the community vote, which she claimed took place at dawn, had passed unanimously in favor of overriding my closure decision. I pointed out that none of them had the authority to vote on property that did not legally belong to them, but she dismissed my words with a dramatic flip of her hand and insisted that the HOA bylaws gave them control over all shared visual assets within the neighborhood, including scenic views, and since my lake contributed to the scenery she argued that the HOA therefore possessed partial rights to it. Her logic was so bold and absurd that even the other residents holding clipboards exchanged confused glances, but she kept going, listing imaginary regulations and invented clauses, while I stood there sipping my coffee and wondering how someone could say so many incorrect things with so much confidence. She finally ended her monologue by shoving a bright orange violation notice into my hand, declaring that I was being fined for disrupting scheduled community event. I almost laughed at how childish the whole situation had become in less than 24 hours, but before I could respond she waved to a second group of residents who immediately rushed forward with tape measures and stakes, attempting to draw boundary lines through the snow as if they intended to physically carve out pieces of my property for their imaginary festival zones. One man tried to measure the distance between my cabin and the shoreline while muttering something about calculating sound ordinances, another hammered a wooden stake into the ground so close to my driveway that it nearly hit my shoe, and a third knelt down with a clipboard, sketching out a map that looked suspiciously like he was planning a full-scale carnival complete with food trucks and stages. I reached over and pulled the stake from the ground, tossing it aside before telling them all to leave. But the HOA president yelled that I had just destroyed official HOA property and that another fine would be added to my record. I asked her what record she was referring to because I was not an HOA member, but she snapped back that all homeowners in the vicinity were considered honorary members whether they liked it or not, which made even less sense than her argument about scenic rights. The situation only grew more ridiculous as she pulled out her phone and declared she was calling the sheriff, insisting I had assaulted HOA volunteers by interfering with their measurements. I simply nodded and told her to go ahead because the sheriff already knew who owned the lake and the land around it, and once again her face flushed with that special brand of fury she reserved for moments when reality contradicted her expectations. She tried a different tactic then, lowering her voice as she walked closer, adopting a strangely gentle tone as she attempted to sweet-talk me into reopening the lake. She mentioned holiday spirit, community unity, childhood memories of winter festivals, and the importance of tradition, but each soft line was wrapped in veiled threats about social isolation, neighborhood gossip, and future disputes she promised I would not win. When I refused again, her friendliness cracked like thin ice under a heavy boot and she reverted instantly to shouting, accusing me of being selfish, cold-hearted, and power-hungry for refusing to let hundreds of people gather on unsafe ice. The hypocrisy was so blatant it would have been funny if not for the growing crowd forming behind her, all of them whispering, pointing, and scribbling things on their clipboards like they were documenting every breath I took. I walked back to my porch with my mug, ignoring the barrage of shouted threats, and I sat down on the top step watching the spectacle unfold as if I were witnessing some bizarre performance art. The HOA president then marched toward the lake and began placing homemade wooden barriers along the shoreline with signs proclaiming festival preparation, zone keep out, which was ironic considering she was standing on the property I owned while telling me to stay away from it. I watched her slip once on the frozen snow, flailing her arms before pretending nothing happened, and then she called out to her team to start marking parking sections. Within minutes cars were being parked haphazardly along the narrow road, blocking driveways and trapping a few unfortunate residents who had no idea what was happening. When one man tried to leave for work, the HOA president stepped in front of his car and told him he could not drive through an active event preparation zone, and when he complained she threatened to fine him too. More chaos erupted as volunteers carried folding tables and large boxes toward the lake, leaning them against trees while discussing booth arrangements and whether the lake could support ice sculptures. Every part of their plan contradicted the fact that the ice was unstable, but they continued as if the laws of physics would bend to accommodate their holiday ambitions. I finally walked back over to them and told them all to leave for safety reasons, but the HOA president refused to stop, shouting that I was interfering with community progress and that I should be grateful they were improving the area with their hard work. Her voice grew louder as she accused me of destroying the local holiday spirit, and she kept insisting that the community had rights, her committee had rights, the festival had rights, and that my lake was obligated to participate whether I liked it or not. The absurdity of her words made me wonder if she had slept at all or if she had stayed up all night drafting plans fueled entirely by caffeine and delusion. I stepped closer and pointed out the cracks near the center of the lake, visible even from the shore, and reminded her that if anyone fell through the ice she would be held responsible for ignoring warnings. She dismissed the dangers with a wave and said the ice always cracked a little this time of year, insisting that it was all part of winter aesthetics. My patience finally stretched thin, so I told them all to pack up before someone got hurt, but instead of listening the HOA president turned toward her group and yelled that they were being bullied by a property tyrant. The crowd erupted in sympathetic murmurs and exaggerated nods, and within minutes they began chanting "Reopen the lake" like a strange winter protest. I stood there watching them shout slogans into the cold air while the snow continued falling in quiet flakes around us, and in that surreal moment I realized just how desperate they were becoming. Their tactics had shifted from intimidation to emotional manipulation to full-blown public theatrics, and it was clear that they were willing to escalate far beyond petty fines and threat. Whatever was driving this frenzy was bigger than a holiday festival, and as the HOA president shouted orders to her clipboard army, I knew something hidden and dangerous was pushing them forward. Something they did not want me to uncover. The snowfall finally eased into a quiet stillness by the afternoon, but the peace felt artificial, stretched thin over something unsettled beneath the surface. The HOA had retreated for the moment, leaving behind scattered footprints, abandoned stakes, and a lingering echo of their earlier chanting that drifted around the lake like a reminder of the chaos they were determined to unleash. Something about their desperation gnawed at me more than the shouting, more than the threats, more than the absurd claims about scenic rights or community ownership. They weren't acting like a group protecting a tradition. They were acting like people running out of time. Curiosity tugged at me harder than frustration, pushing me to understand why they wanted the lake opened so desperately that they were willing to risk cracked ice, legal consequences, and humiliation. The answer was buried somewhere beneath their frantic behavior, and I knew that if I wanted to survive the tidal wave of HOA nonsense coming my way, I needed to uncover whatever they were hiding. I grabbed my coat, stepped off my porch, and began walking toward the opposite end of the lake, where the shoreline curved into a cluster of homes that belonged to the HOA board members. As I walked, I studied the ice again, noting the thin white fractures spidering beneath the surface, the ones they had pretended not to see earlier. It bothered me that they had ignored such obvious warnings. Either they were reckless beyond imagination, or something about the festival mattered so much to them that physical danger no longer registered. When I reached the tree line, I noticed fresh tire tracks heading toward the HOA clubhouse, a squat wooden building they treated like a miniature capitol building for their neighborhood empire. Out of habit, I stayed quiet as I approached, moving between the trees, watching from a distance as clusters of board members hurried inside carrying boxes, folders, and rolled-up banners. They looked stressed, voices raised even through the closed windows, gestures sharp and frantic. I couldn't hear much, but the tone alone told me something was unraveling behind those walls. I stayed hidden for a long moment, watching the flurry of activity as if I were observing a colony of alarmed creatures scrambling after realizing their nest had been disturbed. Finally, I circled around the back where a cracked window revealed part of the conference room. I knew spying was not exactly neighborly, but considering they were trying to force hundreds of people onto dangerous ice, my guilt evaporated quickly. Through the window I saw the HOA president pacing like an animal trapped inside a cage, waving a stack of papers at the others while two board members argued loudly with each other. One slammed a binder onto the table so hard it rattled the pens. I leaned closer, straining to catch fragments of their conversation each time someone raised their voice. Pieces floated through the window, incomplete but enough to ignite suspicion. Words like contract and sponsor and penalty drifted out, sharp and tense. Someone mentioned refund and breach and deliverables. Another person muttered something about last year's budget not covering another failure. Then came the part that made my stomach tighten. One board member, the treasurer, said loudly enough for me to hear every syllable that if the lake stayed closed, their biggest sponsor would pull out and the HOA would be financially crippled for the rest of the year. The president responded furiously, insisting the festival had to happen, that the sponsor required proof of event size, foot traffic, and community participation to release the final payment. She slammed her hand on the table and declared that without that money the HOA would collapse under overdue maintenance costs, fines they had accumulated from the county, and a failed landscaping project that had drained far more money than they ever admitted. Suddenly their panic made perfect sense. This wasn't about holiday spirit or tradition or community bonding. It was about money, desperation, avoiding public humiliation. They needed the lake open because it was the only place big enough to stage a festival that met the sponsor's requirement. Without the festival they couldn't keep the sponsor. Without the sponsor they couldn't pay their debt. Without paying their debts the entire HOA would fall apart, and the president would lose every scrap of power she so proudly clung to. I stepped back from the window, exhaling slowly as the pieces snapped together in my mind. Their frantic behavior, their threats, their attempts to bully me into reopening the lake all made grim sense now. But understanding their motives didn't solve anything. In fact, it only confirmed what I already suspected. They were willing to do anything to force this festival onto my frozen property, no matter the danger. As I turned to leave, a soft voice drifted behind me, making me freeze. It was Mrs. Talbot, one of the quieter residents who lived in the small yellow house near the wood. She had always kept her distance from the HOA drama, avoiding meetings and rarely participating in neighborhood feud. She stood in her backyard holding a bag of birdseed, looking at me with a mixture of worry and apology. She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if afraid someone might hear. She told me I wasn't the only one the HOA had been pressuring lately. They had gone door to door all week trying to gather volunteers and threatening residents who refused. She whispered that the HOA had already spent the sponsors' advance payment on projects they didn't finish, and that the president had been covering up the overdue invoices by falsifying budget summaries. If the sponsor showed up and discovered the festival wasn't happening, the HOA would be investigated. Fines, audits, charges, everything would come crashing down. That was why they were desperate. That was why they were going to push this festival through even if the ice cracked under their feet. She warned me to be careful because the HOA president was losing control under the pressure and had been talking about using community bylaws or county loopholes to force compliance from unwilling residents. I thanked her quietly, grateful someone in this neighborhood still had common sense, and I promised her I wouldn't let the HOA risk everyone's safety just to save themselves from the consequences of their own mismanagement. She nodded and returned to feeding the birds, glancing over her shoulder nervously at the clubhouse. With the truth now uncomfortably clear, I headed back toward the lake. The cold air nipped at my face, carrying the distant murmur of meeting room arguments behind me. The situation had shifted from a simple dispute into something far more complicated and far more dangerous. Their festival wasn't just a celebration. It was a lifeline they were clinging to so desperately they were willing to lie, cheat, threaten, and gamble with lives to keep it afloat. I knew then that the confrontation ahead would not be solved with a simple conversation or another explanation about ice safety. The HOA was cornered, and cornered people always acted irrationally. If I wanted to stop them from dragging the entire community into disaster, I needed more than warnings. I needed evidence, hard proof, something undeniable that would expose everything before the situation spiraled completely out of control. As I reached the snowy shore again, staring out at the fractured ice glistening under the fading daylight, I knew this was only the beginning of uncovering what they had hidden. The truth was deeper than frozen water, and if I was going to protect my lake, my property, and the people too afraid to stand up against the HOA, I was going to have to dig even further into their secrets. The following morning arrived with a sharp, biting cold that made every breath feel like a thin blade sliding down my throat, but even the weather could not dull the determination settling in my chest as I stepped out onto the porch and stared across the frozen lake shimmering beneath the pale winter sun. After hearing what Mrs. Talbot revealed and watching the way the HOA panicked behind closed curtains, I knew the time for simply refusing had passed and the time for uncovering the full truth had begun. Whatever they were hiding was bigger than a simple budget mishap or wasted advance payment, because no group of adults became this desperate unless something was threatening to unravel everything at once. Their behavior had gone beyond stubbornness and crossed into the territory of frantic survival, the kind where lies pile on top of lies until the weight becomes unbearable. I needed proof, real proof, enough to expose whatever illegal deal they were covering up, and that meant going places the HOA never intended anyone to see. I decided to start with their storage sheds, which sat near the far end of the lakeside path tucked behind a grove of pines. Those sheds had always been suspiciously locked, guarded by signs warning non-members to stay out, and used under the guise of storing festival decorations and equipment. But over the last year I had noticed boxes being delivered there at odd hours, vans arriving when most residents were sleeping, and the HOA president always nearby acting strangely protective of the sheds. Curiosity had nagged at me then, but now suspicion prodded sharply like an arrow to the ribs. As I approached, I made sure no one was watching from nearby houses before cutting through the trees where the snow crunched softly under my boot. The sheds stood in a line like neglected soldiers, paint peeling, locks rusting, but one of them was newer, cleaner, reinforced with a heavy-duty metal latch that looked out of place in a quiet lakeside neighborhood. I circled around the back, checking for alarms or cameras, and found none, which only confirmed that the HOA operated on arrogance rather than caution. I tested the hinges, and they were stiff with cold, but the back panel had a section where the wood had warped slightly over time, revealing a small opening near the bottom corner. Kneeling down, I brushed away the snow and peered inside. The dim interior was cluttered with crates, stacked papers, plastic bins, and several large boxes marked with unfamiliar branding. I tugged at the loose panel until it bent just enough to slip through, scraping my jacket as I squeezed inside. The musty smell of dust and old cardboard filled my nose, but it was what I saw next that made my pulse kick up. The boxes were labeled with the name of a regional events company I recognized, a company known for renting out large-scale festival equipment, professional lighting rigs, carnival tents, and sound systems. I pulled open one of the crates and found stage lighting gear worth far more than any typical neighborhood festival would ever need. Another crate contained unopened generators, stacks of rented event chairs, and banners from corporate sponsors whose logos I had never seen the HOA mention. Then in the corner, half buried beneath a tarp, I found a binder. It was thick, heavy, and stuffed with contracts, invoices, estimates, and correspondence between the HOA and a regional corporate festival sponsor who apparently had invested a significant amount of money into transforming the HOA Winter Festival into a large public event, one that would attract hundreds, possibly thousands of visitors. My heart sank as I flipped through the documents. The HOA president had signed agreements promising enormous foot traffic numbers, media coverage, vendor fees, structured zones, ticketing areas, and full-scale festival layout plans that extended far beyond any reasonable neighborhood event. She had promised the sponsor that the main attraction would be a massive ice festival held on the lake itself, complete with ice sculptures, skating performances, vendor booths, bonfires, music stages, and crowds that the lake was never intended to hold. Worse, the contract revealed that the HOA had already received a substantial first payment, spent most of it, and still owed the sponsor a deliverable that they had no way of fulfilling now that the ice was unstable. The final payment was contingent on proof of festival setup, but the HOA had failed to meet previous deadlines and was in breach of several conditions. A letter tucked into the back of the binder spelled it out clearly. If the HOA failed to deliver the promised festival, the sponsor would not only pull the funding but also file a legal complaint demanding repayment of the funds already given. The HOA president had signed a personal liability waiver, meaning she would be held responsible if the HOA could not repay the debt. She had trapped herself in a financial noose, and to escape she was gambling the safety of the entire community. As I kept flipping, I found something even more damning. A handwritten note on the margin of one of the pages indicated that the HOA had altered the festival permit forms before submitting them to the county. They had claimed the lake was under full community jurisdiction, that the ice conditions were stable, and that a private land agreement had been secured. My name was forged on one of the addendums. A wave of anger rose sharp and hot in my chest as I stared at the signature that belonged to no one but a desperate fraud. The HOA president had forged my consent. She had falsified county documents. She had lied to sponsors and involved the entire community in a dangerous event built on deception. I gathered the pages, took photos with my phone, and carefully returned the binder exactly where I found it before slipping back out of the shed through the warped panel. My breath came hard and fast in the cold air as I hurried toward the woods, heart pounding with a mix of fury and disbelief. They had crossed a line far beyond petty HOA antics. They were operating illegally, risking lives and property in hopes of avoiding financial ruin and personal destruction. As I reached the path near my cabin, I saw movement through the trees and stopped. The HOA president stood near the edge of the lake with two board members, pointing at various locations on the ice as they discussed where to place stages and booths. Her voice carried on the wind, thick with determination and empty confidence. She was still planning to go ahead with the festival regardless of the danger. Regardless of the forged document. Regardless of the fact that the ice groaned ominously with every gust of wind. She was desperate enough to ignore everything because losing the festival meant losing everything she had built her identity around. Watching them from a distance, I realized the next step would be confronting her, not with warnings this time but with evidence. Hard facts she could not twist or shout over. But I also knew the moment I revealed what I had uncovered, she would lash out in ways more unpredictable than anything she had attempted so far. The storm brewing beneath her composure was far from over. And I had just uncovered the truth that would finally break it open. The rest of that day unfolded under a sky that never quite brightened, as if even the sun hesitated to look down on the absurd escalation already taking shape around the lake. After discovering the forged signatures, the illegal contracts, the reckless financial mess the HOA had created, I had expected guilt or panic or at least a hint of shame when I confronted the president, but instead I found a level of boldness so outrageous it crossed into a kind of theatrical madness. I approached her while she was bossing volunteers around, directing them to place makeshift cones and flags along the lake's edge, all while ignoring the deep crack running near the center like a warning carved into the ice itself. I told her plainly that I had seen the shed, the documents, the fraudulent contracts, the forged permits, the sponsor agreements, all of it. Her face went pale for the briefest moment, a flicker like a candle guttering in the wind, but it was enough to confirm everything. Then she straightened her shoulders and switched into full attack mode, accusing me of trespassing, breaking and entering, spying, and interfering with HOA business. I told her it was difficult to interfere with something illegal when the entire operation was already built on breaking laws, but she raised her chin and declared she had every right to take whatever steps necessary to protect the community festival. I tried to keep my voice calm as I explained that I now had enough evidence to bring county inspectors, auditors, and law enforcement into this situation, but instead of reacting like a rational adult faced with consequences, she responded by declaring a state of emergency within the HOA. She shouted something to her board members about activating contingency protocols, which sounded ridiculous enough to make a few volunteers pause mid-step, but then the whirlwind of retaliation truly began. Within an hour they had placed orange cones across the entrance to my driveway, blocking both my truck and my path home. When I tried to move one, the HOA vice president appeared with a camera, recording me as if I were a burglar caught in the act of grand theft cone removal. I told him to stop, but he yelled that I was destroying HOA safety equipment and would be fined accordingly. I reminded him again that I was not an HOA member and therefore not under their jurisdiction, but he muttered some twisted new interpretation of neighborhood law and continued recording. When I pushed past him and moved the cones aside, he gasped dramatically like I had committed an unforgivable crime. Minutes later, a volunteer taped a bright neon notice to my front door claiming I was in violation of noise ordinances even though I had not made a sound. Another notice accused me of obstructing community operations. A third claimed I had failed to submit a winter landscaping form, a document I knew for a fact did not exist because they were obviously inventing rules on the spot. They plastered the side of my cabin like a passive-aggressive art installation, and by the time I removed the first few, 3 more had appeared. Eventually I stopped pulling them off because clearly the HOA had decided that overwhelming me with nonsense paperwork was their new strategy, so I left the stack of neon accusations hanging like decorations on a very confused holiday tree. But that wasn't the end of their retaliation. Soon a group of volunteers marched down the path carrying a portable snow fence, which they attempted to assemble across the boundary between my property and the public walking trail. They hammered stakes into the frozen ground with the enthusiasm of people who believed they were performing a heroic civic duty, even though I told them repeatedly they had no right to alter my land. The HOA president appeared again, triumphant, announcing that she was enforcing a temporary no-cross zone due to what she called my escalating hostility. I was about to point out how ridiculous that sounded when a county truck rolled up, tires crunching through the snow. It was an inspector from the Environmental Department, clipboard in hand. For a moment I felt relief, assuming someone had finally taken my warnings seriously, but then the inspector told me he was responding to an anonymous complaint alleging that I had contaminated the lake with chemicals, endangering wildlife and putting the community at risk. I almost laughed at the sheer desperation behind the accusation. The HOA president hovered behind him, pretending to be concerned, clutching her coat dramatically like she was shocked at the possibility of my alleged wrongdoing. When the inspector asked to take a look around, I allowed him to test the lake water, the soil, the snow, anything he wanted. As expected, everything came back clean, and when he asked who filed the complaint, the HOA president quickly blamed a mysterious resident who conveniently did not exist. The inspector left annoyed, telling her to stop misusing county resources, and she watched him go with a smile so tight it looked painful. She whispered something to herself, and then turned to me with renewed determination as if she were already planning her next move. And she did not wait long. By mid-afternoon she had contacted the sheriff's office, claiming I was threatening volunteers and obstructing a community event. The deputy who arrived knew me, and after hearing both sides he sighed in that world-weary way that only people tired of HOA drama can sigh. I explained about the forged documents, the falsified permits, the financial misconduct, and the dangerous ice conditions. The deputy looked at the president and asked if any of that was true. She stuttered, deflected, accused me again, and finally insisted the deputy had no authority here because this was an HOA matter. The deputy reminded her that forged signatures, fraudulent permits, and public safety hazards were absolutely his jurisdiction, and for the first time she lost her composure in front of an outsider. Her voice rose higher, her gestures sharper, her panic surfacing like cracks under the lake ice. The deputy warned her that going ahead with the festival would violate county safety codes, and she responded by shouting that the county had no idea what they were doing and that she would not let bureaucrats ruin the most important event of the year. When the deputy left to file a report, the HOA president rounded on me, furious, accusing me of sabotaging everything deliberately. She told me that if the festival was shut down, it would be my fault, the community would blame me, and I would regret not cooperating. She lowered her voice into a cold whisper and vowed that she was not done fighting. She said the lake would open whether I liked it or not. She said no one would stop her. With every threat, every new violation notice, every absurd tactic, it became clearer that she no longer cared about reason or safety. She was acting from pure desperation, clinging to the last scraps of control while everything she had built teetered on the edge of collapse. Her retaliation was not just about punishing me. It was about trying to scare me into compliance before the truth exploded in her face. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the temperature dropped again, I stood on the edge of the lake watching the ice shift and groan beneath its own weight. The cracks were wider now, the danger unmistakable, and as I stared across the frozen surface, I knew one thing beyond any doubt. If she wanted a war to protect her lies, then I would end this fight with the one thing she feared most: the truth. The next morning began not with peace or quiet but with the jarring clatter of metal poles, thudding footsteps, and the unmistakable crackle of a loudspeaker being tested, all of it echoing across the frozen lake like an unwanted alarm clock dragging me into a battle I already knew was coming. I stepped outside and stared in disbelief at the chaos unfolding on my property. The HOA had arrived in full force before dawn, hauling trucks, vans, folding tents, sound systems, and all the festival equipment they had been hiding in those sheds, as if they were staging a last desperate attempt to build an empire before anyone had the chance to stop them. The HOA president stood at the center of the madness, bundled in a bright blue parka embroidered with the words Winter Festival Committee, barking orders like a general preparing for war. Volunteers rushed around stacking tables, untangling string lights, and dragging enormous boxes toward the lake's edge. Some were even brave enough to venture onto the ice carrying wooden pallets, ignoring the loud, unsettling groans echoing under their boots. It was a scene so reckless and absurd that for a moment I thought I was dreaming. But the cold wind on my face and the crunch of snow under my feet snapped me back to reality. They were really doing this. They were really going to risk their lives and the lives of hundreds of residents just to avoid admitting they had lied, forged documents, and misused funds. The desperation had reached its breaking point, and she clearly believed that if she built the festival quickly enough no one would have time to intervene. I walked straight toward the lake with a determination that cut through the cold like a blade. As I approached the president, I could see the strain behind her confident facade. Her eyes were frantic, her movements sharp, her voice too loud and too fast. She knew the walls were closing in, but instead of stopping she had doubled down. I told her calmly that she needed to gather her group and leave immediately because I had contacted the county and formally reported the forged permits, the fraudulent contracts, and the dangerous conditions of the ice. She froze for a moment, just long enough for her breath to hitch in her throat, then forced a laugh that sounded brittle enough to shatter. She accused me again of lying, of interfering, of inventing problems to ruin the festival, but her voice wavered and the volunteers around her exchanged uneasy looks. Before she could launch into her next rant, the sound of approaching engines cut through the freezing air. 2 county vehicles and an environmental safety truck rolled into view, tires crunching through the snow as they stopped near the shore. Inspectors climbed out carrying equipment, clipboards, and cold expressions that hinted they already suspected trouble. Behind them, a deputy sheriff stepped out of his cruiser, the same officer who had visited the day before. He adjusted his hat, exhaled a cloud of white breath, and walked toward us with a slow, steady determination that made the president take a step back. The county safety inspector wasted no time. He headed straight for the lake, drilled into the ice in several locations, and frowned as the drill bit punched through with little resistance. He scanned the cracks, recorded readings, and shook his head. Then he announced loudly enough for the entire volunteer crew to hear that the ice was dangerously unstable and that no event of any size could legally or safely be held on it. His words sliced through the crowd like a blade. Volunteers froze mid-task, some stepping off the ice quickly, others whispering nervously among themselves. The president's face twisted, her composure cracking like the surface beneath her feet. She stormed toward the inspector yelling that he was wrong, that he was overreacting, that the lake always looked like this in winter, but he calmly pointed out that her festival setup was already violating half a dozen safety codes. When she turned to the deputy sheriff for help, he simply crossed his arms and said he had seen everything he needed the day before. He told her the county had received the evidence I submitted, including the forged documents bearing my signature and the festival permits falsified with incorrect land ownership information. The board members behind her began to panic, whispering, shifting their weight, glancing at one another with fear in their eyes. The president, however, refused to give up. She insisted that the documents were real, that the sheriff and county were being misled, and that she would not let bureaucratic corruption ruin her event. Her voice grew louder, trembling with hysteria, but the desperation made her accusations sound hollow, wild, and unhinged. When the sheriff informed her that the county attorney had requested she cease all festival activity pending investigation, something in her snapped entirely. She screamed that she would not stop, that she had worked too hard, that the community needed this festival, and that it would happen no matter what anyone said. Then she tried a last-ditch strategy that would have been laughable if the stakes weren't so high. She ordered her volunteers to continue building, shouting that the HOA board had more authority than the sheriff, more jurisdiction than the county, more rights than the landowner. But this time they didn't move. The volunteers looked uncertain, confused, shaken by the inspector's warning and the sheriff's firm stance. The spell she had held over them began to break. Some stepped back, others walked away entirely. Yet even with her support crumbling, she refused to relent. She ran toward the ice, shouting that she would show everyone how safe it was, but the sheriff grabbed her arm before she could reach the weak center. She twisted free, yelling at him not to touch her, and in her frantic movements she slipped and nearly fell before catching herself on one of the wooden pallet. The inspector ordered everyone off the ice immediately, and this time people listened. Watching her unravel so publicly, so completely, tore away the last layer of control she had been clinging to. But her collapse wasn't the end of her retaliation. Once the crowds dispersed under the sheriff's direction, she turned on me, face red, eyes wild, and declared that if she could not hold her festival here, then no one would. She vowed to destroy everything, to shut down every access point, to make sure the community blamed me for the chaos. Then she stormed away with the board scrambling behind her. But I wasn't finished. After the officials cleared the lake and halted all festival operations, I followed the sheriff to his truck and handed over every photo, every contract copy, every forged document I had taken from the shed. The county inspector added his safety findings to the growing list of violations. It was enough to shut down the festival entirely and trigger a full investigation of the HOA's finances, actions, and leadership. By mid-afternoon the county issued an emergency order temporarily closing the lake area to all public or HOA access, meaning the festival was officially dead. The HOA president's dream collapsed in a single day. She had fought, lied, threatened, and manipulated, but in the end, the truth had pinned her down harder than any confrontation could. As the trucks pulled away and the volunteers trudged home, defeated and shivering in the cold, I stood on the snowy shoreline staring across the frozen water, feeling the tension slowly drain from my shoulders. The lake was quiet again. Safe again. Untouched by the festival chaos that could have ended in disaster. But even as calm settled around me, I knew one thing for certain. The HOA president might have lost today, but desperation like hers never vanished quietly. She would come back. She would fight again. And the final confrontation sprawled like a shadow on the horizon, waiting for the moment she decided to strike. The wind cut across the lake that evening with a sharpness that felt almost deliberate, as if nature itself was warning everyone to stay away, but warnings had never stopped the HOA president before, and they certainly did not now. Even after the county had shut down every part of her unauthorized festival operation, after the sheriff had issued formal notices, after her volunteers had scattered in confusion and embarrassment, she refused to let go of the collapsing empire of her own making. By nightfall the entire neighborhood buzzed with tension, whispers spilling from porch to porch as residents argued about what had happened, who was to blame, and whether the HOA president had finally gone too far. I had barely settled inside my cabin, still warming my hands after the long cold day, when headlights flickered through my window, followed by the sound of multiple car doors slamming. I stepped back outside, breath fogging in the frigid air, and saw a large group gathering at the shoreline. Flashlights flickered like restless fireflies, cutting through the dark as dozens of frustrated residents crowded near the frozen lake. At first I thought maybe the HOA president had come to issue one last dramatic apology or perhaps resign under pressure, but then I spotted her standing on a large patch of ice near the shore, shouting into a megaphone like someone possessed. She was declaring that the festival would continue despite the county's interference, that the HOA would take back their rights, and that no one could stop them from finishing what they started. Her voice rang through the cold, carrying over the frozen surface with a desperate command that made several people recoil in disbelief. Before I could even process what she was doing, she pointed at me with theatrical fury and accused me of destroying the community's biggest tradition, of colluding with the county, of sabotaging the HOA, and of wanting to seize control of the neighborhood. Her words stirred up the crowd in the worst way, igniting a mix of confusion, anger, and fear. Some residents shouted back, demanding the truth. Others supported her, chanting her name or yelling for the festival to continue. It was a frenzy, a boiling pot on the edge of spilling over, and I realized she had gathered them here on purpose. This was her last stand, her final attempt to regain control by whipping the community into a frenzy and forcing a showdown she believed she could win. I walked toward the gathering crowd slowly, aware of how many eyes swung my way. The ground crunched beneath my boots as I approached the frozen edge where she stood, the megaphone shaking in her trembling hand. Her hair was wild from the wind, her breath ragged, her cheeks flushed from rage and cold. She looked like someone whose entire world was crumbling, and she was willing to drag everyone else down with her. I raised my voice to tell everyone to step away from the ice, to warn them again that the temperature drops that day had weakened the surface even further, but the president cut me off with a shrill shout demanding silence. She declared the ice safe. She declared authority over the lake. She declared I had falsified county reports even though the inspectors themselves had shown up with equipment. She declared that traditions mattered more than fear, and that the community would not bow to lies. Her voice cracked on the last word, and then she did something even more dangerous. She walked deeper onto the ice. The crowd gasped as the frozen sheet groaned under her weight. Several people yelled for her to stop, but she lifted the megaphone again and insisted she was proving how strong the ice was. She stomped her foot for emphasis, and the sound echoed like a muffled drumbeat beneath us. I stepped closer, the sheriff's earlier warnings ringing in my ears, and shouted for her to come back to shore. She ignored me completely, eyes blazing with a mix of fury and panic. She kept yelling that she would not let anyone ruin her festival, not the county, not the sheriff, not me. She took another step, and the ice beneath her shifted visibly, a thin crack shooting outward from her boot like lightning darting across glass. The crowd erupted into terrified shouts. Some people backed away immediately. Others rushed forward instinctively as if trying to help her. The situation was seconds away from disaster. I moved on to the shallower edge of the ice, feeling it shift beneath my weight, and held up my hands to steady the growing panic behind me. I told everyone to keep back and not crowd the frozen surface, but the HOA president only twisted the situation to her advantage, screaming that I was now trying to block people from coming to help her. She insisted no one should listen to me, that I had lied from the beginning, that I was manipulating the community. The crack beneath her widened with another brittle snap, and suddenly the danger was no longer theoretical. She wobbled, arms flailing, barely catching herself before falling. A group of residents screamed in unison. I yelled again for everyone to move back, but a few impulsive residents stepped onto the ice anyway, desperate to pull her away from the danger. Their combined weight sent a deep groan rumbling across the lake, a warning so loud it felt like the ice was shouting at us. I forced myself forward slowly, carefully distributing my weight, inching closer to keep them from making fatal mistakes. The cold seeped through my boots as the thin layer of snow crunched beneath me. Every step sent a jolt of worry through my chest. I called to the woman closest to the president, urging her to step back, but the president continued to twist every word, shouting that I was trying to stop a rescue. She was losing control and dragging the entire community into her chaos. All at once, the ice gave a violent crack that echoed like a gunshot. Several people stumbled backward as a fissure darted between us, splitting the ice in a jagged line that shimmered under the moonlight. The HOA president screamed, flailing as she tried to keep her balance. Her panic finally outweighed her pride, and she reached out to the nearest resident to steady herself. He grabbed her arm and pulled, but the sudden shift of weight caused the thin sheet beneath them to dip. For a horrifying second it looked like both of them would plunge into the freezing water, but by some miracle the crack stopped spreading. I seized the moment, shouting for everyone to freeze in place. A wave of silence rushed across the lake, broken only by the trembling breaths of terrified residents. I told the woman holding the president to slowly guide her back toward the shore without sudden movement. The woman nodded, her eyes full of fear, and together they inched step by step toward the bank. The lake groaned again but held. When they finally reached solid ground the entire crowd exhaled at once, the tension releasing like a held breath finally allowed to escape. The president collapsed to her knees, clutching her chest, gasping for air. The residents who had supported her a short while ago now stared at her with shock, fear, and dawning realization. They had nearly died for her delusion, for her lies, for her desperation. I remained on the edge of the ice long enough to ensure no one else attempted anything reckless. When I stepped back onto snow-covered ground, a hush settled over the crowd. The president's power had shattered. Her authority dissolved the moment the ice nearly swallowed her whole. Residents began murmuring among themselves, voices low and shaken, piecing together the truth they had ignored for too long. Some confronted her directly, asking what she had been thinking, demanding answers. She could barely speak, hands trembling, voice cracking as she tried to salvage her dignity, but the illusion was gone. The sheriff arrived moments later, summoned by frantic calls from residents, and he stepped into the chaotic scene with a stern expression. When he asked what happened, the entire crowd erupted into overlapping explanations, pointing to the president, describing the cracks, the lies, the danger. She tried to defend herself, insisting she had only been protecting the community, but the sheriff raised a hand, silencing her, and informed her she would be questioned in a formal investigation. The look on her face then was not fury this time, but something far more hollow. Fear. The kind that takes root when someone realizes their last excuse has crumbled. As the sheriff escorted her away, the residents stood in stunned silence, shaken by how close they had come to tragedy. And in that heavy, cold air, I knew the final reckoning was waiting just ahead. The morning after the chaotic confrontation on the lake arrived with a heavy stillness, the kind that settles over a place after something dangerous has passed but the echo of it still lingers in the air. The trees stood motionless, the lake lay frozen and quiet as if ashamed of the fear it had caused, and the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath collectively, waiting for whatever came next. I stepped outside and watched the faint mist rising from the snow illuminated by the pale winter sun, and I could almost feel the shift in the atmosphere. Something had broken last night, something larger than the ice. The HOA president's grip over the community had been shattered publicly and unmistakably, leaving a raw unease in its place. Residents who once followed her commands without question were now whispering about danger, lies, and misplaced trust. Some avoided eye contact, others approached me quietly to thank me or apologize, their voices burdened with guilt. It felt as though the entire neighborhood was thawing out from months, maybe years, of her intimidation, but beneath that thaw was a deep uncertainty about what came next. The county investigation moved quickly. By midday the sheriff returned with 2 county officials and a folder so thick it looked like it could anchor a ship. They knocked on my door and asked me to accompany them to the HOA clubhouse, explaining that they needed to finalize their review of the evidence, clarify a few statements, and present findings to the remaining board members. I followed them along the snowy path, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and exhaustion curling through my chest. The clubhouse, usually bustling with the false energy of HOA meetings, felt eerily quiet when we entered. A few board members huddled around a table, their faces pale and tense. They looked like people who knew the hammer was about to fall and had no idea where to run. The sheriff laid the thick folder on the table and began methodically going through the evidence. He started with the forged permit applications, pointing out the inconsistencies, the altered forms, and the signature that did not match mine. Then he moved to the financial documents, showing how the HOA president had pocketed portions of the sponsor funds, misclassified expenses, and created false budget summaries to hide the growing deficit. The investigator added his findings about the festival vendor contracts, the breach clauses, the unpaid invoices, and the personal liability the president had signed without the board's consent. Each new revelation sent ripples of shock across the board members' faces, their shoulders sinking deeper with every page. Then the sheriff recounted the dangerous stunt on the lake the night before, describing how she had coerced residents into stepping onto unstable ice, nearly causing a mass casualty event. The board members looked horrified, shaking their heads, whispering uncertain apologies. Finally, the county attorney presented the formal ruling. The festival was permanently cancelled. The HOA president was removed from her position effective immediately. She faced multiple charges including fraud, endangerment, falsification of county documents, and misuse of community funds. She would also be required to repay every cent she spent without authorization. When the sheriff announced that she had already been taken into custody earlier that morning, the room fell into stunned silence. Not one person defended her. Not one person asked for leniency. The last fragments of loyalty had evaporated on the lake the night before. After the officials left, the board members remained seated in silence. A few looked at me with an expression that mixed regret, embarrassment, and a kind of gratitude they did not know how to articulate. One of them finally stood and approached me slowly. He apologized not just for the festival mess but for years of blind obedience to someone whose authority had grown unchecked. He admitted they had ignored complaints, overlooked irregularities, and allowed the president to bully her way through decisions because confronting her always seemed more exhausting than compliance. It was a confession that carried the weight of too many years of silence. I told him that the lake had always been my responsibility, and that protecting the residents from danger was something any reasonable person would have done. I didn't want recognition or applause, just a safer and more honest community. He nodded solemnly, and as he returned to the group, I could see the realization settling over them. They had allowed her control to grow without limits, and they would now have to rebuild a community fractured by her influence. When I left the clubhouse, I felt an odd sense of calm settling over me. The air seemed lighter. The tension that had hung thick over the neighborhood for days was finally dissolving. As I walked back toward the lake, several residents waved from their porches, some offering shy smiles, others stopping me to express their gratitude. A few confessed that they had always known something was wrong but never felt brave enough to challenge her. One elderly man admitted he had avoided neighborhood events entirely because the president made everyone feel like they were living in her kingdom instead of their own homes. Their words were quiet reminders of how deeply her reach had extended, and how relieved they were to finally breathe again. When I reached the edge of the lake, I stopped and looked out over its still frozen surface. The cracks remained visible, long and jagged, reminders of the danger that had nearly consumed so many people. But now the ice seemed peaceful, resting under the sunlight. A few birds hopped near the shoreline, pecking at the snow as if reclaiming their territory after the chaos. Mrs. Talbot appeared beside me, wrapped in a thick scarf, her cheeks red from the cold. She watched the lake for a long moment before speaking softly. She thanked me again for standing up when no one else did, for being the one person who refused to bend under pressure. She said the neighborhood needed someone who understood where to draw a line, even when everyone else was too afraid to see it. We stood there for a while in comfortable silence, two people who had survived a storm neither of us had asked for. Eventually she returned home and I walked back to my cabin, feeling the weight of the past days finally lift from my shoulders. As I reached my porch, I turned back one last time. The lake stood quiet, the wind tugging gently across its surface. The chaos was gone. The shouting, the threats, the desperation, all of it had faded into memory. What remained was a calm winter morning, a community finally free from the grip of a leader who had been willing to sacrifice them all. Inside my cabin, I finally let myself relax. For the first time in days, the silence felt peaceful instead of tense. The storm had passed. The truth had won. And as I sat near the window watching the snow drift lazily across the frozen lake, I realized something else too. Sometimes winning wasn't about triumph or praise. Sometimes it was simply about preventing disaster, protecting people who didn't know they needed protecting, and standing firm even when everyone else wavered. The lake would thaw in spring, the ice would melt, and the memory of this ordeal would settle into the town's history like a cautionary tale. But the peace settling over the water now made it clear. The danger was gone. The festival was finished. and for the first time in a long while, the lake was mine again.